0430 hours, September 1944. Near the Franco-German border, a forest clearing shrouded in dense, freezing fog. A young American soldier, Private First Class David Underwood, a commercial illustrator from Philadelphia before the war, knelt in the muddy grass, his hands numb with cold. He was not tightening the tracks of a tank or loading artillery shells. He was wrestling with a thick, rubberized canvas valve, his breath forming rapid white clouds in the frigid air. Behind him, the dark silhouettes of what appeared to be M4 Sherman tanks, 105mm howitzers, and heavy transport trucks began to take shape, their forms grotesque and limp. These were not weapons of steel, but weapons of imagination. They were inflatables. The air compressor hissed, a sharp, mechanical snarl that cut through the pre-dawn quiet. Underwood flinched, his eyes darting toward the mist-shrouded eastern tree line. The noise felt deafening, a beacon announcing their presence. The valve shuddered in his grip as the sculpted rubber skin of the dummy tank began to pulse and swell. Slowly, the crumpled heap transformed. A gun barrel, lifeless a moment ago, stiffened and rose against the gray sky. The tank's hull filled out, gaining weight and solidity in the dim light. But it was a hollow shell. A single bullet would puncture it with a sigh, not a spark. This was the front line for the 1,100 men of the U.S. Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. Their objective was not to kill, but to convince. Their battlefield was the mind of the enemy commander. Their weapons, hundreds of inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, colossal wire-recorded speakers capable of projecting a symphony of fake war noises up to 15 miles, a suitcase full of fake radio operator scripts, and sheer, audacious theatricality. Tonight's mission, codenamed Operation Bedenburg, was one of their most dangerous. The real U.S. Ninth Army was covertly shifting position north for a planned assault. The Ghost Army's job was to make the German High Command believe the entire Ninth Army was still here, in this sector, poised to attack directly east. Failure meant a German counterthrust into a real but undefended Allied flank. The lives of tens of thousands of real soldiers depended on the credibility of this rubber theater. All around Underwood, the specialized companies of the 23rd worked in synchronized, silent urgency. Men from the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion, recruited from art schools like Pratt and Cooper Union, swarmed over the inflating dummies. They were painters, sculptors, set designers. Now, they used brushes and air pumps instead of brushes and chisels. They meticulously applied shadow and grime to the rubber surfaces, using pigments mixed with motor oil. From 50 yards, even in the growing light, the fake tank looked weathered, battle-hardened. They stenciled bogus unit markings, the triangle of the real 6th Armored Division. They scattered tread-marked paths in the mud leading to and from the rubber vehicles. They erected real-looking but empty command tents and field kitchens, the chimneys emitting thin wisps of smoke from small, permitted fires. A quarter-mile away, the sonic deception team of the 3132 Signal Service Company was setting up their apparatus. This was not standard Army equipment. It was technology pioneered in collaboration with Bell Laboratories and sound engineers who had worked on Walt Disney's Fantasia. A soldier carefully unwound thick cable from a spool, connecting it to a massive speaker mounted on the back of a half-track. The speaker itself was a technological marvel, a large, flexible diaphragm designed to replace the tinny, unrealistic sound of metallic horns. Another man checked the connections on a heavy M9 wire recorder. Spooled on this reel was not music, but the carefully crafted soundscape of an armored division assembling for attack. The recordings were pure, clean of background noise, engineered for maximum psychological impact. They contained the deep, guttural idle of multiple Sherman tank engines, the high-pitched whine of their starters, the metallic clatter of treads, the shouted orders of platoon sergeants, and even the distant sound of bulldozers digging revetments. Every sound was tagged, cataloged, and could be mixed in real time using multiple turntables and recorders to create a moving, dynamic audio panorama. The sound engineers understood psychoacoustics, the science of how the brain interprets sound. They knew that to create a believable phantom army, the sound had to have spatial reality. It couldn't just blast from one point. They positioned speaker units hundreds of yards apart. By carefully controlling the volume and sequencing of playback between these separated speakers, they could create a phantom sound. A listener, especially a German listening post operator with headphones, would hear the rumble of tanks not from a speaker, but from the empty field between the speakers. The sound would seem to approach, linger, and recede, the acoustic signature of a vast, maneuvering force. The goal was to trigger the enemy's auditory intelligence to report major armored movement detected in Grid Sector 7B. Meanwhile, the radio deception team, the Signal Company Special, was beginning its shift. They were masters of mimicry. Their orders were to impersonate the entire radio traffic net of the U.S. 6th Armored Division, a unit with over 100 authorized radio operators. A handful of Ghost Army operators now manned their sets inside communication trucks, their fingers hovering over keys. They had studied the fist, the unique sending rhythm and style of the real 6th Armored's operators for weeks. They used the same call signs, the same procedural jargon, but the messages they sent were a carefully written fiction. They transmitted fake movement orders, logistical requests for non-existent fuel and ammunition, routine situation reports for phantom battalions. They followed a precise script that built a narrative. The 6th Armored was here, it was preparing, it was waiting for the order to advance. German Funkabwehr radio intelligence units, constantly scanning the airwaves, would intercept this rich, voluminous, and entirely authentic-sounding traffic. It would be another critical data point for the enemy's intelligence picture. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the fog, a new layer of the deception activated, the atmosphere teams. These men, some of whom were former actors and stage managers, moved into the nearby villages. Dressed in the uniforms of various units, some as 6th Armored tankers with the division patch prominently displayed, others as military police, others as corps-level staff officers, they began to perform their roles. 2 lieutenants from the fictional tank battalion entered a small cafe, their boots muddy. They spoke loudly in English about the upcoming push, complaining about the delay in their artillery support. They left a fake operations map, carelessly folded, on a table. A major drove his jeep recklessly through the main street, shouting at a group of enlisted men to get that damned camouflage netting secured. He stopped to ask a local farmer, in broken French, about the condition of a specific bridge down the road, a bridge that logically would be a target for an advancing army. Every gesture, every overheard conversation, was designed to be observed and reported by the inevitable network of local collaborators and German spies. Back in the forest clearing, Underwood finished securing the last guy wire on his inflatable tank. He stepped back, wiping his cold hands on his trousers. Around him, the clearing was now unrecognizable. Where there had been empty mud and trees 3 hours ago, there now stood what appeared to be the forward assembly area of an aggressive armored battalion. Over 40 tanks were positioned in tactical dispersal. Artillery pieces were sighted toward the east. Fuel trucks were clustered under nets. It was a masterpiece of instant, portable theater, but it was terrifyingly fragile. Then, the sound came. Not from their own speakers, but from the sky. The distant, mosquito-like drone of a Focke-Wulf FW-189 Uhu Owl reconnaissance plane piercing the cloud layer. The German commander was taking the bait. He had sent eyes to confirm what his ears and his spies were already telling him. A hissed order came down the line. Freeze! Stay at your posts! The rule was absolute. When under aerial observation, the men had to act exactly as real soldiers in a real unit would. They could not run for cover. They had to move with purpose between the vehicles. A man pretending to be a mechanic had to pick up a rubber wrench and pantomime working on a bogus engine. Another had to walk slowly from a fake command post to a fake latrine. The sonic team, on a separate cue, began a low-volume playback. The sound of a single tank engine revving, then idling, the clang of a dropped metal tool. Private Underwood, his heart hammering against his ribs, forced himself to lean casually against the cold rubber flank of his inflatable tank. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, fumbled one out, and lit it, his hands trembling only slightly. He took a long drag, looking not up at the threatening drone in the sky, but eastward, toward the unseen German lines, as if contemplating the day's battle. He was a painter from Philadelphia, now an actor on the world's most dangerous stage, his life depending on the quality of the illusion he helped create. The twin-boom silhouette of the Uhu circled twice, a dark bird of prey against the pale morning sky. Then, apparently satisfied with the juicy target below, it turned and droned back toward its own lines to deliver its report. A significant American armored force was concentrated in the forest west of the town, preparing for imminent action. The trap of perception was set. The Ghost Army had successfully drawn the attention and potentially the fire of the enemy onto a force that did not exist. The real Ninth Army's movements to the north remained shrouded in genuine secrecy. For these artists and engineers in uniform, this was victory, not measured in territory taken or enemies destroyed, but in divisions misdirected, attacks delayed, and lives spared, all through the power of a convincing lie. The Ghost Army was not born on a battlefield, but in a London office, from a simple, pressing problem. By late 1943, Allied planners for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, faced a monumental deception challenge. They needed to hide the largest amphibious assault in history from the Germans and, more importantly, mislead them about where and when it would come. Traditional camouflage hid things, but how do you make the enemy see something that isn't there? How do you make him hear an army of ghosts? The answer came from a small, secretive planning cell. The architect was Colonel Billy Harris, a career operations officer, and his deputy, Major Ralph Ingersoll, a former newspaper editor. Their idea was radical: create a mobile, self-contained tactical deception unit. Not a group of spies dropping false documents, but a uniformed regiment that could physically impersonate other U.S. Army divisions at the front line. Their proposal reached the desk of General Jacob Devers, commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe. Devers saw the potential immediately. On January 20, 1944, he issued the order activating the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Its cover name was bland, its true purpose buried in top-secret memos. Recruitment began quietly. The Army didn't need more riflemen, it needed illusionists. The call went out to draft boards and commanding officers. Find men with specific, unusual skills. Scouts descended on art schools like Pratt, Cooper Union, and the Art Students League. They combed through the ranks for commercial artists, architects, industrial designers, and set painters. They sought men who could look at a landscape and replicate its light and texture on a flat surface. For the sonic element, they recruited audio engineers from radio stations and recording studios, and even technicians from Hollywood who understood the dramatic power of sound effects. The radio section needed quick-thinking actors who could improvise dialogue, and sharp-eared operators who could mimic another man's telegraphic fist. The man selected to command this cadre of artists and technicians was Colonel Harry L. Reeder. He was a conventional artillery officer, a solid, pragmatic soldier. His task was to mold this collection of creative talents into a disciplined military unit that could perform under fire. In February 1944, the roughly 1,100 men of the 23rd began assembling at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Their training grounds were not the obstacle courses of infantrymen, but secluded pine forests. The training was a bizarre fusion of basic combat instruction and advanced theater production. The men learned to march, dig foxholes, and handle rifles. They had to look and act like real soldiers when observed. But their core curriculum was deception. They practiced inflating the 93-pound rubber tanks, a task that required speed, teamwork, and silence. A four-man team could have a dummy Sherman fully inflated and standing in under 20 minutes. They learned weathering techniques, using spray guns and brushes to add convincing mud, dust, and shadows to the shiny rubber surfaces. A perfectly inflated tank looked fake. A dirty, scuffed, and partially netted one looked like it had been on the front for weeks. The Sonic Platoon, led by a former radio producer named Major Charles Williams, trained with their prototype equipment. They conducted night exercises, learning to project the sounds of bridging operations or tank columns moving at different speeds. They studied how sound carried over water, through forests, and in different weather conditions. Their recordings were clinical and perfect, which was a problem. Real battlefields were noisy and chaotic. So, they went to real armored units on training maneuvers, hiding their microphones to capture the authentic, messy symphony of a moving division, the backfires, the stalled engines, the overlapping shouts. The radio operators practiced their craft like method actors. They were given the signal operation instructions, SOI, the codebooks, of real combat divisions like the 4th Armored or the 30th Infantry. They memorized the call signs, the operator names, the jargon, and the reporting formats. They held full-scale radio exercises, simulating several days of traffic for a phantom division, building a logical pattern of activity that German listeners would find credible. A single mistake in procedure could unravel the entire illusion. Perhaps the most critical training was in atmosphere. The men of the 23rd had to learn to live their cover. They sewed the shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating onto their uniforms. They drove their trucks and jeeps with that unit's bumper markings. They were briefed on the commanding officers, the nicknames, the recent combat history, and even the gossip of the real division. In French towns, they were to behave like bored, cocky, or anxious soldiers from that specific unit. They were taught to leave traces, a carelessly discarded matchbook with a fake unit insignia drawn on it, a staged argument in a bar about a fictional battalion's location. By late April 1944, the Ghost Army was ready, but it was an untested weapon. They shipped out for England, their specialized equipment crated and marked as sonar research gear or weather balloons. They were billeted near other units, but kept strictly to themselves, their true mission known only to a handful of senior officers. As the final plans for D-Day solidified, the 23rd was given its first, crucial mission, to be part of the Grand Strategic Deception, Fortitude South. While the real first U.S. Army group, FUSAG, under General Omar Bradley, would land at Normandy, the Ghost Army's role was to help sell the fiction of a different FUSAG, one commanded by the formidable General George S. Patton. The Allies wanted the Germans to believe Patton's massive but entirely fictitious army group was still in southeast England, poised to cross the Channel at its narrowest point at Pas de Calais. This would pin down the powerful German 15th Army long after the real invasion had begun. The 23rd did not deploy to France on D-Day. Instead, they went to work in England. They constructed vast, empty camps in East Anglia, complete with inflatable landing craft arrayed along the coast, fake ammunition dumps, and bustling, but scripted, radio traffic that mimicked Patton's headquarters. Their visual and sonic deceptions were a small part of a larger mosaic that included double agents and fake intelligence leaks. The result was a historic success. Hitler remained convinced for 7 critical weeks that Normandy was a diversion. The German 15th Army, with its 19 divisions, stayed put at Pas de Calais, waiting for an attack from an army of phantoms. In early July, the Ghost Army finally received orders for France. The Normandy beachhead was secure, but the fighting in the dense hedgerow country was brutal and stalled. The Allies needed a breakout. For the men of the 23rd, the theoretical training was over. They were going to the real war, where the observers would be seasoned German reconnaissance pilots and veteran intelligence officers, and the consequences of a failed illusion would be measured in blood. Their first test under fire, Operation Brittany, awaited. They would have to convince the Germans that an entire armored combat command was moving west toward the port of Brest, while the real force moved south for the breakout. The artists were about to enter the gallery of war. The effectiveness of the Ghost Army lay not in any single piece of equipment, but in a meticulously orchestrated system of deception. It was a multi-sensory illusion, a symphony composed of 4 distinct but interconnected movements: visual, sonic, radio, and atmosphere. Each element targeted a specific branch of German intelligence, creating a convergence of evidence so overwhelming that the fabricated reality became the only logical conclusion for enemy analysts. The visual deception, the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion. This was the unit's most iconic arm. Their armory consisted of hundreds of inflatable simulacra, M4 Sherman tanks, 155mm long Tom artillery pieces, 2.5-ton trucks, and even imposing DUKW amphibious vehicles. Made of rubberized canvas, or later, a lighter neoprene-coated nylon, these dummies were marvels of practical design. They could be deflated, folded, and packed into a crate small enough to fit on the back of a Jeep. A 4-man team, practiced and efficient, could unload, unroll, and inflate a full-size Sherman using a standard air compressor in under 20 minutes. But inflation was just the first step. A pristine, rubbery tank in a field was an obvious fake. The artists of the 603rd then went to work. They used airbrushes and hand brushes to apply camouflage patterns that matched the local foliage and soil. The critical step was weathering. They mixed pigments with motor oil and dirt to create a paste, splattering it onto the lower hull to simulate mud and dust thrown up from the roads. They airbrushed subtle shadows underneath the gun barrel and along weld seams, creating the illusion of depth and solid mass. They streaked the surfaces with darker tones to mimic rain runoff and grease stains. From 300 yards, even through binoculars, the dummy was visually indistinguishable from the real thing. The visual deception extended beyond the vehicles themselves. The men created entire environments. They used real camouflage nets, often borrowed from other units, to partially cover the inflatables. They laid down miles of fake tread marks using modified bulldozer blades or simple rollers attached to jeeps, creating intricate patterns of ingress and egress. They set up tents for a fake headquarters, complete with empty map boards and field telephones connected to nowhere. They positioned dummy fuel drums and wooden crates marked ammunition around the site. At night, they enforced strict blackout discipline on the fake encampment, but allowed a few carefully placed administrative lights, the glow from a tent flap, the pinpoint cherry of a cigarette, to suggest the quiet, vigilant presence of troops. The goal was to create a target so tantalizingly real that German aerial reconnaissance would waste precious sorties photographing it, and artillery would waste precious shells trying to destroy it. The sonic deception, the 3,132nd Signal Service Company. If the visual deception was the body of the Phantom Army, the sonic deception was its voice and its heartbeat. This was cutting-edge, secret technology. The core equipment was the Sonic Car, a specially modified armored half-track. Mounted on its back was a powerful speaker assembly, a 500-pound papier-mâché and wire contraption with a large, flexible diaphragm. This speaker, connected to a complex array of amplifiers and wire recorders, could project a clear, intelligible soundtrack for over 15 miles under ideal conditions. The recordings themselves were works of intricate audio engineering. Teams had spent weeks with real combat units, capturing thousands of sounds on state-of-the-art wire recorders. They had cataloged everything: the distinct chug of a Sherman engine at idle versus the higher whine of a Stuart light tank, the metallic clank, clank, clank of treads on cobblestones versus the softer crunch on dirt, the shouted sequences of a tank commander ordering his driver, the sounds of bulldozers digging gun emplacements, even the ambient noise of a busy motor pool at dusk. These were not random noises. They were edited into specific, half-hour-long programs with dramatic arcs. Program A might simulate an armored battalion moving into a forward assembly area, the initial rumble of approaching engines, the sounds of vehicles maneuvering into position, engines cutting off, voices calling out, the gradual settling into silence. Program B might simulate the dawn preparation for an attack, engines coughing to life, the increased radio chatter, the final revving before movement. The true genius was in the deployment. The Sonic cars were never placed among the inflatable visuals. They were positioned up to a mile away, often behind a hill or within a dense patch of woods. Using multiple cars spaced hundreds of yards apart, the operators could create a moving sound source. By fading the volume up on one speaker and down on another, they could make the sound of a tank column appear to travel down a road, turn a corner, and fade into the distance. To a German listening post operator, trained to identify unit types by their acoustic signature, the evidence was clear. An armored force of specific size and composition was on the move in a specific direction. His report would go directly to his division's intelligence officer, corroborating what the aerial photos of the inflatables were showing. The radio deception, the signal company special. This was the brain of the operation, providing the detailed narrative that tied everything together. Radio was the primary, real-time communication tool for all armies. German Funkabwehr radio intelligence units were exceptionally skilled. They could triangulate transmitter positions, identify individual operators by their unique fist or keying rhythm, and analyze traffic patterns to deduce a unit's size, location, and state of readiness. The Ghost Army's radio platoon was a team of master forgers. Before each mission, they were given the signal operation instructions, SOI, of the real unit they were impersonating, the 6th Armored, the 30th Infantry, the 95th Division. This was the unit's communications Bible, containing all its call signs, frequencies, operator codes, and security protocols. For the duration of the deception, the ghost operators became the radio net of that unit. A handful of men would mimic the traffic of an entire division's worth of operators. They followed a meticulously written script that outlined a full day's routine and tactical radio traffic. At dawn, the headquarters station would check in with its subordinate battalions. They would send fake situation reports, request fictitious supplies, Baker Company requests resupply of .30 caliber ammunition, estimate 20% remaining, and pass along routine administrative messages. The traffic would build in intensity as the fictional unit prepared for a mock action. The operators had to know the jargon, the abbreviations, and even the personal quirks of the operators they were imitating. A message might include a casual, "Hey Charlie, how's that carbine shooting?" A piece of authentic-sounding chatter that sold the reality of the conversation. This volume of realistic, procedurally correct radio traffic was perhaps the single most convincing piece of evidence for German intelligence. It was a signal that could not be faked by a few loudspeakers or inflatable tanks. It required a fully functional, staffed headquarters. The atmosphere, the invisible performance. This was the human element, the final layer of credibility that turned a technical display into a lived reality. Every man in the 23rd, regardless of his technical specialty, was an actor when in towns or villages near the deception site. Wearing the shoulder patches and vehicle markings of the unit they were impersonating, they performed a silent, pervasive play for the benefit of the local population, from which German intelligence inevitably drew informants. Small teams would enter a cafe. 2 sergeants would sit at a table, unfolding a map and arguing loudly in English about the best route for their tank platoon to take to the front. A lieutenant would make a show of asking the bartender detailed questions about road conditions to the east. Jeeps marked with the fake unit's insignia would race through narrow streets, MPs, played by ghost soldiers, directing non-existent traffic at key intersections. Soldiers would, accidentally, drop a piece of trash with the unit's designation on it. They would complain in earshot of locals about their damned colonel or the poor food from their company kitchen. The goal was to seed the area with consistent, low-level information. When a German intelligence officer debriefed a local collaborator, the story would be coherent. Yes, the Americans here are from the 6th Armored. Yes, they are anxious and preparing to move. Yes, I saw their tanks in the woods on the hill. The synchronization of these 4 elements, visual, sonic, radio, and atmosphere, created a feedback loop of false confirmation for the enemy. The aerial photo showed tanks. The sound recording reported tanks moving. The radio intercepts revealed the tank unit's headquarters issuing orders. Human intelligence confirmed the tankers were in the local bars. Every branch of the enemy's intelligence apparatus, aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and human intelligence, reported the same conclusion. The Phantom Force became, in the mind of the German commander, an undeniable, high-priority threat that demanded his attention, his reserves, and his fire. He was now reacting to a work of art, and his own forces were being moved like pieces on a chessboard he could not see. The Ghost Army's transition from rehearsal in England to performance in France was abrupt and jarring. In late July 1944, they landed at Omaha Beach. The scene was one of organized chaos, beaches still littered with the rusting hulks of landing craft, roads choked with supply trucks moving inland, the distant, constant rumble of artillery. For the artists and technicians, this was the first visceral smell of the war they were to manipulate. Their debut mission, supporting Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy, was immediate and critical. Operation Brittany, July-August 1944. The U.S. Third Army, under General Patton, had just become operational. Its audacious plan was to break out west into the Brittany Peninsula to capture vital ports, while the main thrust turned east toward Germany. The Ghost Army was tasked with making this westward diversion even more convincing. The 23rd was ordered to impersonate the entire 6th Armored Division, one of Patton's spearheads. Near the town of L'Homme-Chamaldeau, the 603rd inflated a full combat command of rubber tanks and trucks. The sonic trucks, positioned in nearby orchards, began broadcasting the sounds of an armored division assembling at night. The radio operators spun a web of fake traffic, creating the narrative of the 6th Armored refueling and receiving final attack orders. Meanwhile, atmosphere teams, wearing the 6th Armored's triangular patch, flooded local cafes in surrounding villages. They complained loudly about the slow progress of their recon units toward Avranches. The deception was successful, but it was also perilously thin. German artillery, convinced by the display, began shelling the Phantom assembly area. Shrapnel ripped through the rubber tanks, causing them to deflate with comical, alarming wheezes. Engineers had to run forward under fire to make hasty repairs, re-inflating vehicles even as more shells landed. The mission proved the concept worked. German forces were fixated on the fake threat, but it also taught a brutal lesson. The enemy would respond with real steel. The Ghosts learned to deploy their illusions just outside the range of direct fire, and to be prepared for rapid displacement. Operation Borden, September 1944. As Allied armies raced across France, supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The advance stalled along the German border. The Ghost Army was now in constant demand. In September, near the Luxembourg border, they executed Operation Borden. This time, their mission was defensive. The U.S. front line was dangerously thin. The 23rd was ordered to impersonate the entire 83rd Infantry Division, a force of over 10,000 men, along a 15-mile sector. This was a more complex, sustained deception. They couldn't just create a static display. They had to simulate the daily life and gradual reinforcement of a holding division. Over several days, they built a convincing presence. Inflatable trucks and artillery were placed in fields and woods. The sonic units played the sounds of construction at night, troops digging foxholes and setting up wire obstacles. The radio net broadcast the mundane traffic of a static division: routine patrol reports, requests for spare parts, casualty and strength returns. To add critical movement, they executed a traveling show. A convoy of 10 2.5-ton trucks, each towing a single inflated rubber tank wrapped in a tarp, would drive back and forth along the same stretch of road visible from German lines. To a distant observer, it appeared as a continuous stream of armor moving into the sector. They repeated this loop for hours. German intelligence reported the 83rd Division was being heavily reinforced with tanks. As a result, the opposing German division, which had been probing for weak spots, halted its reconnaissance and assumed a defensive posture. For over a week, 1,100 Ghost soldiers tied down a German division that outnumbered them 10-1 in real infantry, allowing the real Allied line to solidify. The crisis at the Gap. Operation Viersen, March 1945. The masterpiece. By March 1945, the Allied armies were on the west bank of the last great natural barrier into Germany, the Rhine River. The main crossing, Operation Plunder, was a massive, carefully planned assault near the town of Wesel. The U.S. Ninth Army's role was to cross further south. To guarantee success, the Allies needed the Germans to believe the main crossing would occur at a different location, drawing their reserves away. This mission, Operation Viersen, would be the Ghost Army's most important and ambitious performance. Their objective? Convince the German High Command that the U.S. 31st and 79th Infantry Divisions, over 30,000 men, were concentrating for a major assault crossing at the town of Viersen, 15 miles south of the real crossing site. The scale was unprecedented. The 603rd deployed over 600 inflatable vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even inflatable bulldozers. They constructed a dummy supply dump with hundreds of empty wooden crates and fuel drums. They laid miles of fake tank tracks and truck tire marks leading to the river's edge. They set up a phony Corps headquarters tent complex, complete with working, but fake, antenna arrays. The sonic deception reached its zenith. For 10 nights leading up to the real crossing, the 3,132nd speakers projected a symphony of invasion preparation across the dark water of the Rhine. The recordings were sequenced to tell a story. Night 1. The distant sound of engineer units arriving and trucks unloading. Night 3. The unmistakable thump-thump-thump of pile drivers as if building a pontoon bridge. Night 5. The mixing of tank engines with the sounds of landing craft outboard motors. Night 7. The amplified voices of officers giving detailed, shouted orders for boarding procedures. The soundscapes were so convincing that nearby real American units reported hearing enemy activity and requested artillery support on the empty German side of the river. The radio deception was a full-time operation. 8 operators mimicked the entire radio network of 2 full divisions. They transmitted fake bridgehead reports, urgent calls for ammunition across the river, and casualty evacuation requests. They even enacted a radio panic on the night of the real crossing, with frantic messages about heavy counterattacks on their fictional beachhead at Viersen, further selling the idea that the main battle was there. Atmosphere teams, wearing 30th Division patches, the old Hickory Division, operated boldly in the rear areas. They engaged in staged arguments with real military police at crossroads, demanding priority road space for their artillery column. They spread misinformation in cafes near the front. The result was a tactical masterpiece. German forces, including elements of the potent 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, were decisively shifted to the Viersen sector. They reinforced the riverbanks, laid extra minefields, and positioned their artillery to fire on the phantom assembly areas. When the real Ninth Army launched its actual, silent crossing on the night of March 23 to 24, 1945, they met only light resistance. The German reserves were looking the wrong way, held in place by an army of rubber and recorded sound. Senior Allied commanders later estimated that the Viersen deception saved between 15,000 and 30,000 real Allied casualties. For the Ghost Army, it was the definitive proof of their unique and devastating form of warfare. Their final act, in the war's last weeks, was Operation Bedemborg, where they impersonated an armored division to cover the Ninth Army's movement, the scene with which this story began. By war's end, the 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had executed over 20 major battlefield deceptions across Europe. They had impersonated more than a dozen different divisions, sometimes 2 at once. They had drawn enemy fire onto empty fields, pinned down enemy divisions with imaginary threats, and covered the movements of hundreds of thousands of real troops. They fought a war of perception, and on that battlefield they were undefeated. As they moved into a defeated Germany, their last task was to pack away their inflatables, silence their speakers, and prepare to vanish into history, bound by a secrecy oath that would last for decades. The guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945. For the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, victory was accompanied not by public parades, but by a stern, binding order: silence. They returned home under a cloak of secrecy, their unique war records sealed, their stories untold. Their equipment, the meticulously crafted inflatables, the pioneering sonic rigs, was gathered, catalogued, and largely destroyed or forgotten. The Ghost Army was ordered to disappear, its existence classified as top secret and buried within the vast archives of the war. For over 50 years, one of the most creative and effective tactical units of World War II remained a footnote known only to a few veterans and high-level planners. Their true legacy, therefore, exists on 2 levels: their immediate, measurable impact on the battles of 1944 to 45, and their profound, enduring influence on the very nature of military deception. Tactical analysis: why the Ghost Army worked. The unit's success was not accidental. It was the product of a revolutionary, interdisciplinary approach that exploited specific vulnerabilities in the German military intelligence system. 1. Multisensory overload. The German military, like all modern armies, relied on a process of Kreuzpeilung, cross-referencing intelligence from multiple independent sources to verify a fact. The Ghost Army expertly poisoned every well. They provided visual evidence, reconnaissance photos of tanks; acoustic evidence, sound recordings of armor; signals evidence, realistic radio traffic; and human intelligence, soldiers in cafes, fabricated documents. When Luftwaffe reconnaissance, signals intelligence, Funkabwehr, and field agents all reported the same thing, German commanders had no reason to doubt the conclusion. The deception was not a single lie, but a fully constructed, self-consistent reality. 2. Exploiting German military doctrine. The German command structure, particularly under Hitler's increasing micromanagement later in the war, was often rigid and slow to react to fluid situations. Once a threat assessment was made based on intelligence, it was difficult to reverse. The Ghost Army's deceptions created high-confidence, high-priority targets that demanded a doctrinal response: the shifting of reserves, the reinforcement of sectors, the commitment of artillery. By the time the ruse was discovered, if it ever was, the real Allied maneuver was already complete. 3. The artistic advantage. The unit's composition was its secret weapon. A traditional soldier is trained to destroy and defend. An artist is trained to observe, interpret, and recreate reality. A stage designer thinks in terms of sets, sightlines, and audience perception. A sound engineer understands how audio creates environment and emotion. These men approach deception not as a military checklist, but as a holistic creative problem. They understood that a perfect inflatable tank was useless if the shadows it cast were wrong, or if the surrounding set lacked the clutter and disorder of real military life. Their attention to atmospheric detail, the fake laundry lines, the staged arguments, the carefully weathered paint, provided the convincing texture that made the illusion stick. 4. Limitations and risks. The Ghost Army was not invincible. Their deceptions were tactical and operational, not strategic. They could impersonate a division for a week. They could not create the myth of an entire army group like the Fortitude deception did, which relied on double agents and fake diplomatic leaks. Their tools were fragile. Rubber tanks deflated under shrapnel. Sonic broadcasts could be distorted by wind or rain. Their greatest vulnerability was ground patrols. If a German infantry squad had ever penetrated one of their dummy positions, the game would have been over. Their security depended on distance, observation, and the enemy's reluctance to risk a patrol based on what they believed was a heavily fortified area. Strategic impact and numerical legacy. While difficult to quantify with absolute precision, post-war analysis and unit-after-action reports provide compelling data on their effectiveness. The 23rd executed 22 large-scale deception operations across Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine. They are credited with directly saving an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives by diverting enemy forces and fire onto non-existent targets. Their most tangible successes were measured in time and space. They delayed the movement of at least 8 German divisions and numerous separate regiments at critical moments. For example, during Operation Viersen, the Rhine crossing, they successfully misdirected the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and other units, which remained in position opposing the Phantom Army for over 72 critical hours while the real Ninth Army crossed against light resistance. In economic terms of warfare, they caused the enemy to waste vast resources, fuel, ammunition, and intelligence focus on phantoms. The long silence and eventual recognition. The secrecy was maintained for compelling Cold War reasons. The techniques of tactical deception were considered a potent, reusable weapon. The U.S. military saw immense value in maintaining the capability and in keeping its methods hidden from future adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union. Elements of the Ghost Army's knowledge and personnel were folded into the nascent psychological warfare and special operations communities. In the 1950s and 60s, the Army stood up new deception brigades and psychological operations groups, the direct institutional descendants of the 23rd, which employed updated versions of visual and sonic deception in Korea and Vietnam. For the veterans themselves, the silence was a lifelong burden. They could not list their real duties on resumes. They received no public recognition. Their stories remained locked away, even as histories of the war were written without them. This began to change in the 1980s, as documents were slowly declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. The dam finally broke in 1996, when the U.S. Army officially declassified the records of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Only then could the full story be told. In 2022, after decades of advocacy by veterans' families and historians, the United States Congress passed, and the President signed, a bill awarding the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. The citation recognized their unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations in Europe during World War II. It was a belated but formal acknowledgement that their war of illusions was as vital to victory as any campaign of bullets. Historical significance: the bridge to modern warfare. The Ghost Army's legacy transcends World War II. They stand as a pivotal prototype for the modern concept of information operations. Their work demonstrated that in the industrial age, and even more so in the digital age, the battlefield is not just a physical space, but an informational and perceptual one. From rubber to pixels, the inflatable tank has evolved into the digital ghost. Today, military deception employs computer-generated forces, false electronic emissions, and sophisticated cyber operations to create phantom units in satellite imagery and on enemy radar screens. The core principle remains identical: create a believable narrative that the enemy's sensors and analysts will accept as truth. The weaponization of creativity. The 23rd proved that in complex, modern conflict, the skills of the artist, the designer, the engineer, and the actor have direct and immense military value. Breaking an enemy's decision-making cycle requires creativity as much as firepower. This interdisciplinary approach is now fundamental to special operations, cyber warfare, and strategic communications. The ethics of the illusion. The Ghost Army fought a bloodless war, aiming to save lives on both sides by preventing direct combat. Their story raises enduring questions about the morality of warfare. Is a deceptive operation that saves 20,000 lives by causing the enemy to waste shells on empty fields more or less honorable than a traditional assault? They operated in a gray area where the act of lying became the ultimate humanitarian gesture. The men of the 23rd were soldiers, but they fought with the tools of the studio and the stage. They understood that to defeat an enemy, you must first enter his mind. They used imagination as their primary weapon, and in doing so, they shaped the reality of the battlefield, saving countless lives and leaving a doctrine of deception that echoes through every modern conflict. They were the artists of war, and the canvas they painted on was the enemy's certainty. If you found the story of this secret army of artists as fascinating as we do, let us know in the comments below what other unconventional or forgotten units of history you'd like us to cover next.